Listen closely. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive breath or ink. If you hear this and feel uneasy, that's your instincts waking up, because once a man knows how lies are born, he can never unsee their bloodstains. On a choking August night in 1847, on a plantation swallowed by Mississippi humidity and silence, a woman screamed, not in labor pain alone, but in terror. Two boys slipped into the world within minutes of each other, twins by the clock and the womb, but not by the truth. One was pale as candle wax, the other dark as river-soaked soil. In that moment, an entire empire built on order, hierarchy, and control cracked. And the people in power did what they always do when reality threatens their illusion: they erased it. Within 3 days, 4 people were dead. Within 2 weeks, men, women, and children vanished like smoke. Records were locked away, testimonies rewritten, graves left unmarked. And the story you were taught, that this was a shameful scandal, was a lie designed to protect something far darker. You see, history isn't written to preserve truth. It's written to preserve systems. The plantation wasn't just land. It was a machine, a psychological factory designed to manufacture obedience, fear, and identity. Every rule was there to remind people who mattered and who didn't. Every sermon, ledger, and social ritual existed to hypnotize everyone involved, including those on top, into believing the hierarchy was natural, even divine. The colonel understood this instinctively. He wasn't just a master of land and bodies. He was a master of perception. Reputation was his armor, authority his religion, and bloodlines, pure bloodlines, were the altar upon which everything rested. Which is why the twins weren't just children. They were proof. Proof that the system lied. Proof that control depends on silence. Proof that identity, race, class, power isn't fixed. It's enforced. His wife's confession didn't destroy him because of desire. Desire was common, normalized, even expected. What destroyed him was exposure. A single biological anomaly threatened to unravel generations of manufactured certainty. If 2 sons from one womb could be born to different fathers, what else had been carefully constructed? What else was fake? And here's the part that should unsettle you most. The response wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Calm, efficient. What followed wasn't rage, it was policy. This story doesn't begin with betrayal. It begins with a system realizing it might be exposed. And systems don't panic. They eliminate. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the world. The colonel lived in a world where morality wasn't guided by conscience, but by preservation. Power didn't come from being right. It came from being unquestioned. The Mississippi Delta in that era was not simply farmland. It was an isolated psychological enclosure. Distance from cities meant distance from scrutiny. Distance from scrutiny meant freedom for men like the colonel to become something else entirely. In places like this, reality bent to whoever controlled the story. And the colonel controlled everything: money, law, pulpits, and fear. The plantation outwardly resembled order. Rows were straight. Ledgers precise, bodies accounted for, numbered, categorized. But beneath that surface ran a constant low-grade terror. Terror wasn't accidental, it was engineered. People obey better when they don't fully understand why they're afraid. That principle didn't only apply to the enslaved. It applied to wives, overseers, neighbors, even the colonel himself. His marriage had never been about intimacy. It was transactional. She provided lineage. He provided security. Love was irrelevant. What mattered was continuity, the illusion that everything followed an unbroken line: name, land, blood. But that illusion shattered in a birthing room thick with sweat and candle smoke. The midwife saw it first. She froze. She understood immediately what no one wanted to admit: that biology had betrayed ideology. And biology doesn't negotiate. It exposes. The wife knew too, not because she had planned rebellion or scandal, but because loneliness inside rigid systems creates fractures of its own. Emotional starvation has consequences. When humans are denied connection, they don't become obedient, they become desperate. But desperation is dangerous only when discovered. The colonel didn't strike her. He didn't shout. Witnesses later said his voice barely changed when he looked at the twins. His mind moved ahead of emotion, straight into containment mode. Because when power feels threatened, it doesn't ask who is guilty. It asks what must disappear. Within hours, the plantation shifted. Routines changed subtly. Certain people were reassigned. Others isolated. Night patrols doubled. The quarters were watched more closely than ever. Not out of fear of rebellion but fear of truth spreading mouth to mouth. Because secrets don't escape through documents first. They escape through people. And people, when handled carelessly, talk. That's when it began, the quiet disappearances. A midwife who fell ill. A stable hand transferred and never seen again. An overseer who knew too much and drank from the wrong bottle. Deaths labeled natural. Absences explained away. Local officials cooperative without questions asked. This wasn't brutality for cruelty's sake. This was threat management. Understand this. The most dangerous lies aren't spoken loudly. They're enforced silently. And the colonel wasn't trying to hide adultery. He was trying to preserve a belief system that could not survive proof to the contrary. The twins were not children anymore. They were evidence. Here's where most versions of this story weaken themselves by focusing on scandal instead of structure. Seduction instead of system. But if you're still listening, you already know better. What happened next wasn't personal. It was institutional. Because the moment the truth existed, others had to choose whether to see it. And most people, when their identity depends on not seeing, will destroy their own humanity to stay blind. The plantation preacher declined to baptize the twins together. He said it was a clerical concern. That was the first official lie. When language starts bending, violence isn't far behind. A man trained to sanctify order suddenly concerned himself with timing, lighting, and separate records. Not theology separation. Then came the ledger rewrite. Birth records split. One child assigned a modified name. The other quietly listed under miscellaneous household dependents. Ink became a weapon. Paper became law. But the lie couldn't hold in human memory. People noticed. The enslaved women who cleaned the nursery noticed the difference immediately. They whispered not out of malice, but recognition. They'd seen this before. Their bodies had carried the consequences of white men's secrets for generations. What was new was not the act. What was new was the proof. Children aren't abstractions. They breathe. They cry. They grow. And every day they existed, they contradicted the story everyone else depended on. So fear turned outward. Night meetings began. Male landowners arriving quietly at the main house after dark. No waibs. No servants present except those forced to listen from behind walls. They didn't speak about morality. They spoke about precedent. About what would happen if word spread. About how easily northern agitators could weaponize this information. And here's the part you were never taught. The greatest terror among the elite wasn't rebellion of the enslaved, it was disobedience of belief. If the hierarchy could be biologically disproven, control would collapse from the inside. They weren't afraid of violence. They were afraid of doubt. That's why the disappearances accelerated. 17 people didn't vanish randomly. They vanished strategically. Anyone with proximity, memory, or voice was removed. Some were accused of theft. Others of insolence. A few simply walked into the dark under guard and never returned. And notice this pattern, it still exists today. The system never punishes truth directly. It labels the truth-teller unstable, immoral, criminal, or irrelevant. It doesn't argue. It erases. The wife stopped speaking in public. Her body remained present, but her voice was gone. Isolation works on women differently. She was watched constantly, not as a prisoner but as a liability. The twins were separated. One remained in the house, raised under silence and privilege. The other was sent down the hierarchy, assigned a role his blood contradicted but his existence demanded. Two brothers breathing the same air, living two different realities. Both casualties of a lie they never chose. And if you think this story is about the past, you're missing the lesson it was designed to teach you. Systems don't change. They adapt. By the fourth month, silence had become a discipline. Not spoken, not announced, trained. People learned what not to see the same way soldiers learn not to flinch. The plantation returned to rhythm on the surface, but underneath, something rotten pulsed like an infection sealed beneath skin. The brother raised in the house was taught authority before language. He was handled gently, praised often, corrected softly. Every gesture reinforced entitlement. Servants stepped aside before he learned to walk. His name was spoken with care, as if syllables could protect destiny. He was never told he was special. He was shown. The other brother was never told anything at all. He was placed among the quarters, where instruction came through survival instead of sentiment. His body was read differently, watched differently, punished faster. He learned early that silence was safety and observation was power. He learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to endure, how to remember, and this is where the system made its critical mistake. It assumed identity could be engineered permanently. But pressure doesn't just break things, it forges them. As the boys grew, so did the tension. They crossed paths more often than the colonel intended. A shared gait, a mirrored expression. Two faces echoing one another across a boundary everyone pretended was solid. Enslaved elders noticed first. They'd lived long enough to recognize blood calling to blood, even when names were stripped away. Whispers returned, not loud, but persistent. Stories survive not because they're shouted, but because they matter. The colonel responded the only way institutions ever do when their original solution fails. Escalation. Punishments grew harsher. Public examples were made. Fear was intensified not to correct behavior but to exhaust thought. That's another hidden truth they won't teach you. Oppression isn't designed to control rebels. It's designed to drain the imagination of everyone else. The wife watched this unfold in quiet horror. She understood now what her confession had unleashed: not redemption, not justice, but machinery. Her guilt wasn't emotional anymore. It was existential. She had exposed the system to itself, and the system does not forgive mirrors. Her health began to decline. Nervous ailments, insomnia, shaking hands. Doctors prescribed rest. What they meant was obedience. She complied outwardly while her mind unraveled inwardly. Because once you see how power functions, pretending not to know becomes its own prison. The colonel never wavered. To him, this wasn't cruelty. It was stewardship. Maintaining order required sacrifice. And sacrifice, when reframed properly, becomes virtue. That mindset didn't die with plantations. It migrated. It dressed itself in new language, new institutions, new uniforms. But the mechanism remained the same. Divide identity, control narrative, eliminate witnesses, and above all ensure no one ever connects the dots. Because once men recognize the pattern, they stop being manageable. This is the point where stories usually pause, soften, offer distance. This one doesn't. Because what happened next is the part designed to test who is awake and who is still manageable. By the time the boys reached adolescence, the lie required constant reinforcement. Not protection, maintenance. Like a failing dam patched with bodies and silence. The colonel understood something fundamental about power. Once force is used, it must be used again. Mercy creates variables. Fear creates predictability. The brother in the house was groomed for command. Horse riding before reading. Discipline framed as destiny. He was taught that control was natural, even benevolent. That some men were meant to decide, and others were meant to obey. He absorbed this not because he was cruel but because cruelty, when normalized early, feels like air. The other brother was given labor and pain instead of language. But pain sharpens perception. While one learned how to be seen, the other learned how to watch. He memorized routines, understood where eyes turned away, learned how fear moved through groups like weather. He didn't hate his brother. He understood him. That distinction matters. When whispers turned into murmurs again, when people began quietly asking the wrong questions, the system responded with spectacle. Public punishment, night rides, warning fires visible from the quarters. Psychological warfare meant to collapse courage before it formed. And here's the revelation most men miss. None of this was spontaneous. It was coordinated. Neighbors, clergy, local officials, all aligned not around hatred but around preservation. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as guardians of reality. Because if the lie failed here, it could fail anywhere. That's when resistance stopped being hypothetical. Small acts at first. Tools missing. Work slowed invisibly. Signals passed without words. The brother from the quarters began to influence without authority. Lead without name. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it gathers quietly, waiting for pressure to reach critical mass. And now I need you to do something because this is the threshold. If you understand what's really happening here, if you see how identity is engineered, divided, enforce pause and comment this phrase twice, exactly like this. I see the pattern. I see the pattern. Do it now. It's not superstition. It's declaration. Once spoken, it changes how you listen. Because what came next wasn't rebellion the way history frames it. It was exposure. And exposure is more dangerous than revolt. The system doesn't fear anger. It fears recognition. And once recognition spreads, containment becomes impossible. That's when the colonel made his final decision. And in doing so, sealed far more than his own fate. The colonel didn't announce his decision. Systems never do. They move in paperwork, whispers, and orders that sound reasonable when isolated. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the machinery was already in motion. A census was ordered. Officially, it was about reorganization, productivity, efficiency. But census work has always served another purpose. It reminds people that the system sees them and decides whether they continue to exist within it. Names were called. Categories tightened. Movement restricted. Anyone who didn't fit neatly became a problem to solve. That's when the vanishings began again. Not loudly, not dramatically. People were relocated, worked elsewhere, sent upriver. Paper trails ended mid-sentence. Graves, if they existed at all, were shallow and unmarked. Violence wasn't visible because visibility creates memory and memory creates questions. The brother from the quarters knew what this meant. Survival had trained him for this moment. Patterns repeated. Routes opened. Eyes diverted. He didn't rally crowds. He connected individuals. Real power doesn't scream, it synchronizes. And fear, when shared, transforms into resolve. Meanwhile, the brother in the house felt something he couldn't name. Doubt. Not rebellion, disorientation. He noticed absences. Familiar faces gone. Routines changing. He asked questions and was told half answers wrapped in reassurance. Authority hates questions asked in good faith. Because sincere curiosity bypasses fear. The wife finally broke. Not in madness but in clarity. She understood that her sons were being shaped into opposing instruments of the same lie. One to enforce it, one to suffer it. And that realization destroyed whatever allegiance she had left to the world that raised her. She stopped eating, stopped performing, refused appearances. Doctors whispered diagnoses meant to disguise what was really happening. Moral collapse is not a disease, but institutions treat it like one. Then came fire. Not metaphorical. Real flames in the night. Storehouses. Equipment. Carefully selected targets not to destroy wealth, but to signal capability. Messages written in heat instead of ink. The Delta panicked. Not because of damage but because of implication. This wasn't chaos. It was precision. And precision implies intelligence. The colonel recognized the shift immediately. This was no longer rumor control. This was destabilization. The myth of total dominance, the belief that nothing moved without permission, was dying. So he invoked the last ritual of threatened power, erasure through force. Militias assembled. Outsiders invited in. Legality stretched until it snapped. What followed wouldn't be recorded as it happened. It would be rewritten after. Because history only stabilizes once the dead stop contradicting it. And before dawn broke, Magnolia Creek became something else entirely. A warning. Dawn exposed what the night had tried to hide. Smoke clung low to the ground, settling into clothes, lungs, memory. Magnolia Creek was still standing, but the illusion was gone. Violence had crossed the threshold from tool to language. What followed was not a battle. Battles imply symmetry. This was a purge. Men riding under borrowed authority moved through the quarters with lists names already chosen, fates already agreed upon. Guilt or innocence was irrelevant. What mattered was proximity to the fracture. Anyone too close to the truth became a liability. This is another lesson power never advertises. When lies are threatened, precision disappears. Containment gives way to excess, and excess always leaves evidence. The brother from the quarters had anticipated this. Escape routes mapped, signals prepared, but systems adapt faster than individuals expect. Roads closed, river access blocked, informants rewarded, betrayal incentivized. Not everyone breaks from fear, but enough do to doom the rest. Still, something unexpected happened. The brother raised in the house saw everything. Not rumors, not filtered accounts. He saw bodies carried out. He saw wounds that didn't match the stories. He saw the colonel not as father or master, but as administrator of annihilation. The fog lifted, because violence clarifies what philosophy obscures. And for the first time, he recognized the other boy not as a shadow but as kin. That recognition didn't lead to heroics. It led to paralysis. Systems don't collapse because insiders revolt loudly. They collapse when insiders hesitate, when certainty breaks. The wife was removed before sunrise, officially for her health, unofficially because she had become uncontrollable. Truth-tellers are dangerous even when silent, especially then. The brother from the quarters did not escape. He was taken before the colonel in a private reckoning stripped of witnesses. No shouting, no spectacle, just the quiet violence of finality. The colonel did not see a son. He saw disorder, and disorder in his worldview required erasure. What happened in that room was never recorded, but its consequences were felt for generations. Something passed between them: recognition, defiance, inheritance that no document could fully suppress. Afterward, the plantation endured. That's the most unsettling part. The system survived. It adjusted its narrative, reduced numbers, blamed outsiders, labeled the event an unfortunate disturbance. And people accepted it because they wanted normalcy more than truth. The brother in the house inherited not just land but silence. He learned what happened to those who questioned too much. He became controlled not through fear, but through guilt, which is stronger, because guilt keeps you loyal even when fear weakens. And that's how systems persist, not by crushing everyone, but by recruiting survivors into complicity. If you're still here, understand this. The lie didn't die that morning. It matured. Years later, men would say Magnolia Creek returned to prosperity. Crops rebounded. Records aligned. New names filled old gaps. On paper, the system healed. But scars don't vanish just because ink says they should. The brother who inherited the house grew into his role flawlessly. That was the real tragedy. He learned how to command without cruelty, how to punish without rage, how to maintain order with a calm hand that never shook. From the outside, he looked like progress. Inside, he carried a silence that hollowed him. Because once a man knows the truth of his elevation, that it required erasure, success becomes a prison. Every decision echoes with ghosts. Every act of authority whispers the same question. Who had to disappear for this to remain intact? He never spoke his brother's name aloud, but he saw his face everywhere. In reflections, in dreams, in moments of hesitation that almost became defiance and then collapsed back into obedience. That's how systems win in the long game, not by killing every threat, but by ensuring the survivors police themselves. The story you were taught ends here, with tragedy contained, order restored, history stabilized. But that's not the real ending, because stories like this don't end. They replicate, they become templates. They migrate into corporations, governments, media, families, anywhere identity is divided. Anywhere hierarchy is defended as natural. Anywhere questions are punished faster than crimes. The plantation was never just a place. It was a prototype. And here's the forbidden insight most men never hear. Once you see the pattern, you are no longer neutral. Awareness itself places you outside the system's preferred category. Not as an enemy but as a risk. Because risk thinks. Risk notices. Risk remembers. The purpose of stories like this was never to inform you. It was to condition you, to teach you what happens when truth threatens structure. To train you, quietly, to choose comfort over clarity. But you didn't. You stayed. And that choice matters more than you realize. Because hidden history isn't about the past, it's about how control is maintained right now. The same methods. New names. Cleaner language. Identical outcomes. Silence rewarded. Truth isolated. Identity weaponized. If this knowledge unsettles you, good. Discomfort is the beginning of autonomy. Once illusion breaks, you have two options. Look away, or learn how not to be managed. Most men were never taught to recognize manipulation. You were just given the map. The question now isn't what happened at Magnolia Creek. The question is what you'll do the next time you see the pattern forming around you, above you, inside you. Because once a man sees it, there's no going back. If you recognize the pattern in this story, comment the phrase you wrote earlier again. Not for me, for yourself. Once you name it, it stops owning you.